Hey guys, welcome to what will be part one of me ranking every episode of Black Mirror, seasons 1 through 5 today. We will do 6 tomorrow, and also including the movie and the Christmas special. We're going to do things different to how I usually do it. Instead of going in order and just placing them on the tier list, we are going to go from bottom to top, what I believe is the worst episode of Black Mirror up to season 6, and then to the best episode of Black Mirror up to season 6. 23 episodes we will do today, and the other 6, of course, we will do tomorrow for season 6. But with that being said, let's get started with the worst episode, in my opinion, in Black Mirror's history. To me, it's Rachel, Jack, and Ashley too. I know a lot of people have sympathy for this episode. Some people think this is the best episode in season 5. For me, I was worried that this episode capped off the worst season of Black Mirror with the worst episode in the show. And I wasn't sure that they were ever going to make more episodes of Black Mirror. So when I saw this episode and realized that this could be the last episode anyone ever sees of the show, I got really sad. I have rewatched it and gained a little bit of sympathy for it since. But in my opinion, it's still the weakest of any entry in the series. Now, Miley Cyrus is great in this episode. She is perfectly cast as a pop star who would like to branch out into other means of what she's able to do, but the people controlling her don't want to lose their easy income. And Miley Cyrus is perfectly cast because this is an experience she went through with the Disney Corporation and everything that she had to do to shed her Hannah Montana image. And so them writing this part basically for her as soon as they solidified her casting is fantastic. However, everything else with this episode doesn't quite click into place. The two main characters, or the two girls that propel this episode forward, Rachel and Jack, I think are good in concept, weak in their execution, and I think the child acting isn't as good as it should be for a show at the caliber of Black Mirror. I think both actresses kind of struggle with the material they're given. I think there's a lot of great ideas in this episode that they just didn't grasp entirely with the runtime that they had, and it feels like most of this episode is very half-baked. We really don't meet the real Ashley O until the end of the episode. Everything else obviously is spoken through the doll, and we don't really get into conflict with the doll and everything going on in the world until pretty far into the episode. And so most of this episode is setup and filler for what's left in the rest of the episode. But like I said, there just aren't many ideas that I think land with the time that they were given. It has this cool concept, like I said, of branching out from the norm, artistic integrity, that sort of thing, as we move now into a very common topic of AI art and AI music. This episode predated that by 4 years, and it's cool to see that so many ideas in the show have kind of come to fruition later on down the line, and this is one of those kind of haunting exposés of technology that has now taken over, or concepts that have now taken over the public consciousness. But that being said, they don't really say anything with that, and for me, with a lot of these episodes that I'm going to put in D tier, that's kind of the trend, is they have these really cool concepts, but they're not really fleshed out, or they don't say anything. They speak a lot of words, but they don't mean anything by the end of the episode, and it just kind of sits there. Now, you could argue that that's kind of the point of Black Mirror. The title of the show, Black Mirror, is supposed to invoke a reflection of you looking into a blank TV screen and thinking about what you just saw in the episode. The show isn't supposed to necessarily tell you anything, just get you thinking about things. The problem with episodes like these, though, is they give you these concepts, but it's almost like they're too underbaked, or a little too chicken with their own opinions, the writer's own opinions, to give you definitive direction on which way you should think on these things. Whereas greater episodes that'll sit in A tier and S tier do actually propel you to think, how can we stop this? How can we adjust and think about our humanity in a different way? But that is a very long-winded essay on me saying that I think Rachel, Jack, and Ashley 2 is the weakest episode in seasons 1 through 5. So it sits at 23rd on my list. We go to 22nd, and this is another weak episode. Many people think this is the worst episode in Black Mirror as well. I'm talking about the Waldo moment. Now, the cast of the Waldo moment is fantastic. Just off the top of my head, obviously you have let me pull it up here just so I have an entire cast list here. Black Mirror always has good casts, but the Waldo moment, okay, so you have Chloe Peary as Gwendolyn Harris. I know her from The Crown. She was fantastic in The Crown. I think she's fantastic in this episode. You have Tobias Menzies, obviously, as Liam Monroe, kind of the main, not antagonist, but the main opposing force in this episode. Christina Chong, who I know from Doctor Who, is in this episode. Pip Torrens is in this episode as Philip Crane. I always forget about. It's got a great cast and a lot of cool ideas. And a lot of people like to say that this episode kind of predicted Trump. And in a way it did, but not necessarily in the... People think that this predated this idea of Trump cronyism in politics more than it actually did. We have seen cronyism and humor sides in politics for years. I mean, Lord Buckethead has been running for British Parliament for how many years now? It's not a newfound trend that came after this episode and really developed with the Trump presidency. It's something that has been lying under the surface for many, many years, and we just saw it come to a head with the Trump presidency, and then, of course, with stuff like the Johnson the Johnson ascension to prime minister in Great Britain. We see it with comedians like Vladimir Zelensky leading countries like Ukraine. It's not a new concept necessarily, but what they do with the concept in this episode is new. The problem is this episode puts forth a lot of thoughts and a lot of ideas, and by the end of the episode, none of them really land. There is a really cool scene in this episode where they have all of the candidates for the MP position in a televised interview. And that's when Waldo, or Jamie as Waldo, unloads on all of the politicians there. This is kind of the high point of the episode where he rips Liam Monroe a new one. Sorry, I was thinking Game of Thrones for a second. He rips Liam Monroe a new one. He rips Gwendolyn Harris a new one. And he puts forth all of these ideas about politicians being corrupt and politicians being idiots and the system not working. And that's basically what this entire episode does. The problem with this episode, though, is it doesn't give you any reason to replace that, if that makes any sense. By the end of the episode, the writers of this episode, the characters in this episode, no one puts forth a replacement to this broken system that they're talking about. And so to me, this episode has always come off as a dead idea. Like, yes, we know that politicians are corrupt. Yes, we know that the system needs an overhaul. What should we do about it? Push us in a direction. And what this episode does then is it leaves it blank, and then it flashes forward like 20, 30 years in the future, and the system is replaced now by the CIA running everything by way of Waldo as a mascot for fake politics. But it doesn't really show us how it got there. We know that Waldo made an impact, but it doesn't. The writers don't have the confidence in their own writing, it feels like, to give us a solution to the conflict. It just sets up a big conflict, abandons it, and then flashes forward. And it doesn't give us any of the meat in this idea. But otherwise, I think for the most part, all of the performances in this episode are great. I don't love Jamie as a character. I've never felt like he was super sympathetic. I know that's somewhat the point. He kind of screws his own life up, but it's hard for me to watch an episode where it feels like the writers want us to sympathize with this character when I'm never able to. I'm able to sympathize with basically everyone else in the cast, even, the rich politicians trying to make money off of the product. I can understand where they're coming from with the background that they're given in this episode. But all of this feels really half-baked and like there's no actual resolution to this episode. So for me, I think the Waldo moment sits firmly in 22nd for me. We move up then to what I think is number 21 on the list, and that is Archangel. Now, Archangel is an interesting episode. It's the second episode in season 4, so it succeeded USS Callister, which is one of my favorite episodes of the show. I don't like Archangel. I've never liked watching Archangel. It's another one of these D-tier concepts where it's a cool idea and it doesn't feel like they completely flesh out anything. Now, I do want to make note that this episode is directed by Jodie Foster, who is a fine director in all of her other material. And it was the first episode of Black Mirror directed by a woman, and that shouldn't be like a milestone thing that I'm going to nitpick. The problem with this episode in its directing is it feels like Jodie Foster, all of her directorial decisions in this episode are the opposite of what a good director does. There are montage scenes where there shouldn't be montage scenes. There are cuts where there don't need to be cuts, and there are still shots where there should not be still shots. It feels like everything, granted, I'm not a director, but I have just seen how well directors work with the material they're given in Black Mirror, and it feels like Jodie Foster really fumbled this in its execution. Directors in Black Mirror have really succeeded when they do experimental things that work, and it feels like Jodie Foster did everything experimental in the places that they shouldn't have been experimental and was safe in the ways that they should have been experimental. So she did everything the opposite of what I personally think she should have done as a director. The color scheme, the visuals in this episode are very dull, and not in a way that I like. I like episodes like Metalhead. I like episodes like Crocodile. I like episodes like Playtest in their visuals. Archangel feels very dull, and I'm sure they meant it on purpose, but what they meant by making this a dull episode on purpose, I've never been able to really comprehend. This is a very personal story about personal space and personal just the ability to grow up and experience things on your own, and that being taken away from you by your parents' inability to be confident in their parenting styles. I won't say that I understand that necessarily. I have good relationships with both of my parents, but I know a lot of people really connect with this episode from a relationship with their parents aspect. I understand why things in this episode turn out the way they do. It just feels like nothing in this episode progresses in the way it should have. The story doesn't move the way that it should, in my opinion. I think the technology is cool. It's kind of an expansion on both like the cookie concept and the grain concept. We'll talk a little bit more about that in my Black Mirror technology timeline video that should be coming out soon. I'm not sure if I'm going to get the editing quite done by the end of this week, but hopefully we will see that on the channel sometime in the next month. But Archangel, it feels like there's a lot of concepts there that don't quite deliver. The end of the episode leaves it blank. I don't love the acting in this episode necessarily. It feels like they miscast an actress to play. Hold on, let me pull it up here. This is season 4. Who plays Sarah, the adult version of Sarah? Brenna Harding, who, when this episode came out, was 21 years old, and she's supposed to be 15 in this episode. They don't make her appear 15. And I think part of why it's hard to be sympathetic for her character as a 15-year-old is because it feels like we're watching a sheltered adult. Whereas we should be trying to understand the experiences of a sheltered 15-year-old trying to break away from her mother. We don't get that, or at least I don't get that when I'm watching this episode. I think Rosemary DeWitt does everything that she needs to do in her performance as Marie. But everything in this episode has always fallen flat for me, and I think most of it is down to the directing. And like I said, I like a lot of what Jodie Foster does in her like films and her other directorial material. This episode, it just feels like she did everything the opposite of what I wanted her to do from a directorial perspective. So for me, Archangel sits in 21st place there. Right above Archangel, I am staying in season 5 with Smithereens. When I first watched season 5, Smithereens was my favorite episode in season 5. I didn't love Striking Vipers the first time I watched it. I still don't like Rachel, Jack, and Ashley too. The problem with Smithereens is Andrew Scott's performance is so good that it kind of distracts you from how empty the rest of the episode is. I apologize, there's like a hair on my mouth that I'm trying to get out of my face on camera here. Andrew Scott is a phenomenal performer with all of the material I've ever seen him been given. I loved him in Sherlock despite how controversial and how weird his portrayal of Moriarty was. I think he did great with the material he was given. He is very over the top in this episode, as he needs to be. The problem is, once you get past how good Andrew Scott's performance is in this role, everything else about this episode is bland. Topher Grace just shows up for really no reason at the end of the episode. It's kind of this shock appearance, as if like Mark Zuckerberg himself is supposed to show up at the end of the episode. His performance, as all of his performances are, is really campy, and I know that was kind of the point. This episode plays with comedy where there doesn't need to be comedy there. We see it throughout the episode. There's cool concepts in this episode, what with the Smithereen Company, which is supposed to be a kind of a pseudo-parody of Facebook, having more information than the police and the FBI themselves. That's a cool concept. What we get out of the episode at the end is literally technology bad. That is the only point that this episode makes, that people are too busy looking at their phones to register life itself. We understand that. That's the whole point of the show. You don't have to give us a whole episode literally saying technology bad. All of the other performances in this episode, aside from Andrew Scott, are, in my opinion, mediocre at best. I think there are some cool ideas with the side characters. I think the kid that he kidnaps is motivating in concept. I don't know that the performance was that great, honestly. Everything about this episode is dull except for Andrew Scott's performance. Concept, execution, the ending, I don't think any of it really lands, even if it got off the ground to begin with. It's one of those episodes where the concept is so shallow for me now that, like, the more I watch it, like, the plane never leaves the ground. So you can't say that it lands the plane because the plane never even left the runway. But Andrew Scott's the pilot, and that's why it's not bottom tier for me. So for me, in terms of season 5 episodes, it sits right smack in the middle. I have this one in number 20 on my list, kind of the middle to top of D tier. Moving to number 19, for me, is Bandersnatch. Now here's why. I think Bandersnatch as a concept is beyond S tier. This was the first mainstream interactive movie to ever exist, at least on Netflix, at least in the United States, in mass media concept. It took the world by storm when it came out after Christmas 2018, I think. Like, I remember where I was the first time I watched it. I remember talking about it with my friends. We played through the entire thing over a couple weekends. There is so much material here that they filmed. The concept of Bandersnatch is fantastic. I am ranking it D tier in terms of a content episode of Black Mirror. I don't think the story is great. Any of the stories, really. You walk through a day in the life of this main character, Stefan, and you have a whole bunch of different options to move his life in a way it should. Here's my hot take, and you guys, I know I get a lot of flack from this. I'm not nostalgic for the 80s. I like San Junipero as an episode, but it has very little to do with the 80s nostalgia. I don't love Bandersnatch. Like, I don't hate Bandersnatch because it's stuck in the 80s, literally stuck in the 80s. That's where it takes place. like, I get nothing out of the nostalgia that this takes place in the 80s. I don't get anything out of the video game concepts. I don't get anything about the software development. I think, because who's the cast in this episode? It's Fionn Whitehead and Will Poulter. I think Will Poulter's great. I think his character's written a little over the top. I mean, he knocks it out of the park. Knocks it out of the park with the material they gave him. But I don't think any of these characters are very likable. I like Black Mirror episodes when there are likable characters with flaws, and they're flaws that bring them down. I like that. I like that about Black Mirror. To me, I never felt connected with the characters in this episode. Very similar to how I feel with Rachel, Jack, and Ashley too, character-wise. It's got great ideas, like I said. In concept, I think Bandersnatch as an interactive film is S tier, but the story is very forgettable. The only thing I really remember about Bandersnatch when I'm removed from it and haven't played it in a while is that it's about a kid who's developing a video game. His mom dies at the beginning in a train crash, and he beats his dad to death with a shovel. Is it a shovel? I know he buries his dad. But that's all I remember from Bandersnatch. And I've played through every single option in this episode. I know I have because I went on a website and tracked down how to play every single version of Bandersnatch. And it's still forgettable. I played it again recently just to go through kind of the main stories and be able to put it on a tier list. But like, when I was 4 years removed from Bandersnatch, nothing apart from the concept of it being an interactive film stands out to me. And it still doesn't. It's not great from an episode perspective when you compare it to all of the other episodes in Black Mirror. For me, it sits firmly in 19th place. And then we reach the top of D tier for me. There aren't any F tier episodes in Black Mirror for me, at least not until we get to season 6. Or is there? We'll talk about that more tomorrow. But in terms of seasons 1 through 5, I don't think there's any that deserve to be in F tier, which is good because the person that made this tier list doesn't actually have F tier as an option. I could always add it if I needed to. But top of D tier, the last episode I have in D tier at number 18 on my list is Striking Vipers. I have a couple problems with Striking Vipers. It's the horny video game one. It's, that's kind of the whole point of this. It offers up an exploration into digital sexuality and the option to explore sexuality in a virtual way that has little consequences in the real world. The problem with the concept is, as all of these D-tier episodes are, in its execution. I want to make note that I do like Anthony Mackie in a lot of his material. I don't love him in the Avengers necessarily, but I think he does well in some of his other films. I don't think he's a bad actor. And I'm going to butcher the name unless I look it up here. Give me a sec. Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, I think, is really funny. If you've never seen, what's the second Jordan Peele movie? Us. He is funny in Us. He's also terrifying in Us as his secondary character. I love Yahya Abdul-Mateen as an actor. The problem with this episode comes in the chemistry between Anthony Mackie and Yahya Abdul-Mateen. I keep looking at the name just to make sure I don't screw it up. Their chemistry is weird. And I think I watched this episode a few times before making this list because I really wanted to nail down why I felt like their chemistry was off. And especially as you get to the end of the episode, with the kissing scene, like when they're in real life and they want to figure out if this is a gay thing. That scene is the high point of the episode. And it's a weird high point of the episode. Their line delivery is very weird. And both of the actors underact the scene. And the first time I saw it, I just thought it was because they were bad actors. And then I reconsidered that and I went, well, no, they're not bad actors. I like them in other material. Why do they struggle with the material in this episode? And I almost wonder if they weren't told or if they both collaboratively decided that they wanted their characters to try to maintain their masculinity by coming off as shallow. And what I mean by that is this is a thing that men do. And as a man in his mid-20s who's married and has a lot of couple friends, one thing that men do is, especially with friends that they don't necessarily know or aren't necessarily comfortable with, a big habit of what people do in social interactions is do not expose themselves as far as you normally would with your close friends. So I'm talking like if your wife has a best friend and you're not super close with their husband or their partner, you don't really expose yourself. You're kind of shallow in your interactions with them, right? And so what I get out of Anthony Mackie and Yahya Abdul-Mateen in this episode, more specifically in that scene, is they're trying to up their masculinity for their characters by way of underselling the situation. So when Anthony Mackie delivers the line where he goes, "Just kiss me, man," I no longer see that as him underacting. How do I say this? I don't see that as him not being a good actor. I see that as him portraying his character as underacting the situation to try to maintain masculinity. It's still a weird scene. I think most of this episode lacks direction with the idea of these two men not sure what their sexuality entails. I know that people have argued that scene especially has kind of this underlying, like, both characters do feel something, but both of them are afraid to admit it, to be rejected by the other person. And so both characters reject the idea of their own gayness out of fear of rejection from the other one, if that makes any sense. I don't necessarily think the writing supports that idea. I like that read of it makes the episode come off a little better. But I think in the interactions between Danny and Carl, we don't see their relationship portrayed in the way that I think the writers want us to see it. I think, is it Theo, his wife's name? I think Theo's actress is phenomenal. Her name is Nicole Bahari. I think she's the best performance in the entire episode. I think she is the most sympathetic character. We understand her perfectly. Like I said, as someone who is a lot younger than the characters in the episodes, who is going through a lot similar life scenarios as what the characters are going through in this episode, it strikes a chord with me. But as someone who does not have the eligibility to speak on, homosexual relationships or queer relationships and what they're trying to get off in this episode with, in this exploration of virtual sexuality, in my perspective, it doesn't land. I don't think any of it lands. There's this whole concept of gender swapping in a virtual form that they don't really explore. There is kind of a brief interaction between the two digital characters. None of that is ever explored. They kind of hang on this gay idea and kind of ignore this whole agendered, how would you even describe it? It's not quite a transgender idea, but it's this whole concept of being in a different virtual body, completely separated from your own body, and how that would interact with your own personal gender identity or sexuality, that sort of thing. It's a concept that just sits there, and they never do anything with it because they are too afraid to touch it or say anything about it. My other gripe with this episode is, honestly, I don't think Pom Klementif and Ludi Lin have chemistry at all, beyond the sexual chemistry that we see in the episode. I think their interactions when they're talking to each other are really poor. I don't want to say it's down to their accents. I really don't, because I don't want that to come off as somehow like a racist thing that I'm saying. It's not. I think both of these actors struggle to get their emotions across through the accents that they give their characters in this episode. And I just don't think their chemistry is there. And so when I see this episode and I see them trying to push a sexuality message through these two virtual characters that, in my opinion, don't have any chemistry, none of it really lands. A lot of big ideas in this episode, though, and I think it's a visually stunning episode. I think it's very well directed. I put it top of D tier for me. So let's move into little brighter bulb episodes for me, episodes that I like better. We're moving to C tier now. Number 17 on C tier for me is Men Against Fire. This is another episode that struggles with closure of concept, if that makes any sense. So this episode is one of the more forgettable episodes in Black Mirror. I did rewatch it recently. I liked it, but it fell a little flat for me. The whole story behind this episode is that in the future, soldiers are given implants for them to hunt down subhuman monsters, which by the end of the episode we learn are just normal humans who are genetically weaker than normal humans. And so the society has decided to kill them off by way of using soldiers. Now, this episode has a lot of cool ideas about genetic weakness, genetic predisposition. There are undertones of abortion ideas in there that aren't really explored. There are undertones of sterilization in this episode that aren't super explored. And there are ideas of what, I don't know exactly the term I'm looking for here, but society turning the other way on horrors that we would otherwise not be okay with. The realization that none of the citizens of Denmark, so this episode takes place in Denmark, and the soldiers are going to hunt these monsters, which are called, hold on one sec, they are called roaches, excuse me. The soldiers go to hunt the roaches, and the roaches have already been seen by the society at whole, right? They know where they're at. The fact, we learn at the end of the episode that normal citizens who don't have the mass implant that allows you to change your vision only see these people as normal humans, but subhuman humans, is really impactful, but they don't really do anything with it. The ending of this episode is weird, and I'm never quite sure what they're going for. It's not that it doesn't land, it's just that there are so many different readings on the end of this episode that are so ambiguous and not quite pointing you in an exact direction that it feels a little underbaked. And that's at the end of the episode when he goes home. This is Stripe. When he goes home after he's discharged, he is wiped of his memory. He agrees to not, fight against the mass system. And he returns home to a wife or a partner who loves him, who wants him. And then the camera shifts and we see that all of this is happening inside his head, and he's just standing in the middle of nowhere in a rundown neighborhood. I'm not exactly sure what they want us to take away from that scene or what they're putting on the table in front of us. Because if nothing happens, this guy is going to die and just exist there. And then I think more about that, and I'm like, well, if this has happened to soldiers before, where they're just left at home to die in their own imaginations, why aren't other people seeing that happen? Because society still exists. Especially, they mention that roaches don't exist in the United States anymore. At the beginning of this episode, there's one line that they mention that roaches have all been taken care of in the United States. So when it's implied that Stripe is returned to the United States at the end of the episode, why? I don't know. There's a lot of ideas there that just don't quite land for me. I think all of the performances in this episode are great. Malachi Kirby, Madeline Brewer is fantastic as she plays. What is the character's name? One sec here. I'm using my Wikipedia here. Raymond. And then Michael Kelly shows up at the end of the episode as kind of the instigator of this technology. I don't think it's a bad episode, but it still feels a little flat. So it's not going in D tier, but it's going bottom of C tier for me in 17th place. 16th for me is Metalhead. I think Metalhead is a gorgeous episode. It's a very simple episode, and it doesn't really try to say anything. It is implied to be the furthest in the future of any of these episodes, obviously after humanity has been wiped out. My understanding of the technology, and you'll see this in my technology timeline episode, is that the dogs are a continuation of the mass technology. So the dogs were built to destroy roaches and basically euthanize non-strong genetically predisposed humans, and the technology went wrong and ended up killing every human, and that's where we get in Metalhead. Very simple story. I think the performance by everyone in this episode is fantastic. We really only have multiple characters in the opening scene, but Maxine Peake is fantastic in what she does in this episode. Her different levels of voice, her different fear levels, just the way that she's able to carry this episode by herself is fantastic. Using black and white for this episode was an inspired choice, especially when it's implied how much blood is in this episode and we don't see it because of the different color grading. I do like this episode. It's just overly simplified for what I like in Black Mirror. So I really like complex episodes that are able to land the plane. This is a very simple episode, and for me, that's why it can't go any higher. But I do really like Metalhead in its execution. I think there isn't quite enough there to propel it above middle of C tier for me. So for me, that's why Metalhead sits in 16th place. And then 15th place, top of C tier, is one that I know I'm going to get pushback from in the comments. But for me, it's Black Museum. Black Museum was an episode, it was the second episode I ever saw of Black Mirror. And I really liked it. And the more that I rewatch Black Mirror, and the more that I rewatch Black Museum, the less I like the episode. For me, it's... this is the whole point. It's a rehash of White Christmas. Black Museum is basically a follow-up to White Christmas, where it's 3 distinct stories based around a pioneer of technology, leading to a just kind of a triumphant end, or a victorious end in getting justice for a crime. I think White Christmas does everything better than Black Mirror. I think the 2 early stories are horrific. A little over the top horrific for me, especially the first one. The more I watch it, just the whole idea of pain into pleasure and the whole body horror gag with it really landed for me with, I was into body horror stuff and horror films the first time I watched this episode 5-6 years ago. It's no longer my niche, and I like this episode less because of that. I've kind of grown away from gross out horror and humor and that sort of thing. I think the ending of this episode is good. I think the performance by Letitia Wright is fantastic. I don't think Rollo Haynes is a very likable character, and that might be the point, but I did like him more the first time I watched this episode, and I do like him less the more that I watch this episode. The whole idea of the protests against this man's unlawful or unjust execution, I think hit a lot harder 5 years ago. We were still in the Black Lives Matter era, but it wasn't quite to where it got to in 2020 with the George Floyd stuff. And so this was like post Michael Brown, post Trayvon Martin, but before any of the serious protest stuff. And retrospectively, the ideas that they push forward in the episode, in the third portion of this episode, fall a little empty, if that makes any sense. It feels like they're getting preachy to get preachy, kind of like what I said with the Waldo moment at the end, where like politicians are corrupt, blah, blah, blah. But this episode doesn't really offer any solutions. And by the end of this episode, we're still kind of left with this cosmic horror of her mom being trapped inside her head for potentially eternity. Carrie being stuck in the monkey for all of eternity. Like, it doesn't really do anything with that, and it just kind of unsettles me. And like that's not a negative to the episode, but it just feels like this episode was originally supposed to be the finale to the show, kind of like what I mentioned with Rachel, Jack, and Ashley too. This was before I think they had announced Bandersnatch. I'm sure they were in concept with Bandersnatch already, but it was before Bandersnatch had really been announced to the public, and it kind of felt like this was a way to wrap up the entire series. Just a museum and a rehash of everything in the episodes prior. and it left me kind of unsettled, but it plays it off as this happy thing, and I wasn't quite sure how to handle that. I don't love this episode. Like I said, all of the ideas in this episode are done better in other episodes, and it feels like this episode, people like it just for the nostalgia factor of previous episodes, and this installment doesn't really hold itself up in comparison to all of the others the more I rewatch it, if that makes any sense. And so for me, it's sitting at number 15, top of C tier. Let's move up to B tier, then bottom of B tier, number 14 on my list. I have the national anthem, the first one, the pig one. I'm not gonna say in detail exactly what happens in this episode because I am still a PG channel, I like to think. This is a very interesting episode. For the sake of nothing in this episode has to do with technology. It has everything to do with social consciousness, which is an idea that they use multiple times through the show, surrounded by other technologies and sometimes in its own right. But for being the first episode of Black Mirror, this really doesn't feel like an episode of Black Mirror. The closest I think we get to an episode feeling like the national anthem is Hated in the Nation. It's very similar concepts, very similar in not having a ton of technology in the episode, despite the fact that in Hated in the Nation, which we will talk about in a second, there is technology at the core of it. But what this episode really tries to say is why the Electoral College needs to exist. It has this really hard-hitting concept of people overreacting to a very sudden and distinct need for action. And so the Prime Minister in this episode, Michael Callow, has to either make or not make a decision very quickly. And it devolves into the point where within 12 hours of this situation happening, the Prime Minister does what he does on national television. And it really offers up some cool ideas of just what the common person thinks and wants out of their politicians, or what they would decide is right in a split second, rather than think long term and sympathize with certain characters or certain personalities. Very cool in concept. The problem with this episode comes, I don't know if there are any major problems in this episode. I put it all the way up in B tier. It just feels like there are a lot of episodes that are better than it, and Black Mirror has become a technology show. And so this episode really does kind of feel out of place. It's a hard episode to get through as your first episode in the series. It was the third episode I ever watched, and I was like, what am I watching? But it's kind of the tester episode. Once you get through the national anthem, you can pretty much get through anything in this show. I think all of the performances are fantastic. I always love Lindsay Duncan. Who else is in this? Donald Sumter, I think, is in this episode as well. I think all the performances are great. I think the concept is very well executed, actually. I wish the episode, honestly, was a little longer and played a little more with the repercussions. And I know that part of the episode's charm is the rapid countdown of having to get to the act itself. I just wish that they fleshed it out just a hair more. For me, it sits solid bottom of B tier. We move up to what a lot of people think is one of their favorite episodes. For me, number 13 is White Bear. White Bear is one of those episodes that is fantastic the first time you watch it. The reveal at the end of the episode hits really, really hard. The problem is it loses its credibility the more you watch it because you already know what's coming at the end. They still up the tension. It's still a very tense episode, and you're waiting for the end of the episode. The problem is most of this episode's charm and the luster that surrounds it has to do with the shock of the ending the first time you watch it. And so most of this episode kind of falls a little flat the more that I rewatch it. It's cool to see, once you get to those post-credits scenes and understand the setup of the White Bear White Bear Punishment Park, White Bear, what do they call the amusement park? The White Bear Justice Park. Just this concept of an amusement park centered around getting justice for a crime, and this concept of, have we done enough to punish this person? We understand in the performance that this character has been punished and is sick of her punishment. We feel like she is or at least I do, feel like she is genuinely sorry for her actions. She understands the repercussions for what she did. She has made amends, is ready to die. She wants this punishment to stop. At least that's my read of it. A lot of people really like this episode. I like I said, I like this episode less and less. The more I watch it, it still hits really heavily. There are a lot of plot points in this episode that I pick up that I didn't pick up the last time I watched it. I bet you I've seen this episode 5 or 6 times now. It's still very good, but I think it isn't as strong as a lot of people think it is based on how it loses its X factor the more you rewatch it. So for me, it sits bottom of B tier in 13th place. And we are going to move up to 12th place now with Hated in the Nation, the longest episode in Black Mirror's history. I think it clocks in over 90 minutes. This is another one of those episodes that kind of plays off of the public sphere or the public turning on people, but then using technology to make something happen. So obviously the technology in this episode is digital bees. It kind of touches on this idea that the bees are going extinct, and nothing really comes out of that except the technology of, in the future, we have robot bees that reproduce themselves by building 3D printers of their own technology and then reproducing to basically repollinate the earth. And then people using that technology to critique others and kill others. This episode has a problem similar to Playtest, and we'll talk about Playtest in a second too, where it has a lot of interwoven shock value at the end of the episode, right? So you think that we understand what's going on, and then it throws a swerve at you. And then we think we understand what's going on with that, and then it throws another swerve at you. And so this episode is using shock value and second endings and third endings to give you an ending of this episode that really never ends. I mean, it just keeps going and going and going, and that's part of why by the end of this episode it feels like it drags. Honestly, for the first 70 minutes of this episode, you don't realize that 70 minutes have gone by. This episode, for me, because I do like police procedurals, I think the pacing of this episode is great. It keeps the tension going, it propels the plot forward, and by the time we get to, like I said, like the 70-75 minute mark of this episode, you don't feel like it's been that long. However, in the last 15-20 minutes of this episode, it does start to drag. We have the reveal that the bees are going to kill all of the people who have been a part of this public execution service. And then once we get to that and we learn about the trial, then we get that ending. And then it's revealed in the trial that Blue killed herself. And then we get that ending. And then we get the swerve that Blue's still alive and hunting down this guy who's responsible for it all. And then we get that ending. And it's like the episode just won't end because it's got a new idea that it wants to throw at the screen because there weren't enough ideas in this episode already. I think the setup is great. I think the death of the journalist and the death of Tusk and, I can't remember the name of the third character. I think all of the performances in this episode are great. The cast in this episode is ridiculous. You have, let's see here. If you're unfamiliar with any of the actors or actresses in this episode, Kelly MacDonald is the main character. Her name is Karen Park, the main detective. You probably know her as the voice of Merida from Brave. Distinct Scottish accent. She also played Helena Ravenclaw in the Deathly Hallows movie. And then Faye Marsay, I know her from both, Black Mirror, but then also Doctor Who, as well as seasons 5 and 6 of Game of Thrones. And then Benedict Wong is in this episode as well, which he's always fun. And in this episode, he does one of his more serious roles. And I love when he does his serious roles because I think the MCU uses him way too much as a comedic character. Anyway, the cast is great. The performances are great. The ideas in this episode are great. by the end of this episode, they struggle with where to introduce all of the ideas that they have. And that's why I think the last 15, 20 minutes of this episode really start to slog. A lot of people don't like this episode, and maybe it's because I like police procedurals that I do like this episode. For me, it sits kind of right in the middle of the pack there. Middle to top of B tier, I have it, like I said, at number 12. Number 11 is an episode that a lot of people really like, and I do apologize. I think my voice just cracked there. It's White Christmas. A lot of people really, really love White Christmas. The more I rewatch it, the less I do. I think kind of like Black Museum, and they're virtually the same episode in concept. I think the first two, I shouldn't say that. I think the first and third segments of this episode are great. I think the first segment, right, where he operates an online dating service where they basically stock this guy into, or they stock all of their participants into getting dates, and they get to watch everything that happens, blah, blah, blah. I think that is probably the best part of this episode. Honestly, I used to not like it as much, but the more that I rewatch White Christmas, I think the dating, the first section of this episode, the dating section, the tension is fantastic. Once we start to realize what's going on, like pin drop every single time I watch this episode, I love it. I think Natalia Tena's performance is one of her best performances that I've ever seen her in. I've seen her in Game of Thrones. I've seen her in Harry Potter. I've seen her in a whole bunch of other stuff. I think Natalia Tena is fantastic with what she's able to do in this episode. And the guy she poisons, who is played by Harry, played by Rasmus Hardiker, I think does a fantastic job in just this realization that he's being poisoned and he's really not going to escape, and he is desperate to get out of this room. I think that's fantastic. I think the Una Chaplin stuff, it's a little poor and underdeveloped. The cookie idea, I think there's a lot more they could do with that technology that they end up doing actually in later episodes, but they don't do much with it here except introduce it as a concept. And then the stuff with Joe at the end, I think is good. I think Joe becomes less sympathetic the more I watch this episode. We understand that he's not as sympathetic of a character as we thought the first time we rewatched it. First time we watched it, and the more I rewatch it, Beth is still hard to sympathize with, but I sympathize less with Joe the more I watch this when we understand how bad of a partner he was. That still doesn't give Beth any credence to cheat on him and ignore him the way that he did, but we also don't sympathize with Joe as much. It's two conflicting characters that we could sympathize with either of them, honestly, and it comes out to a very, very messy situation by the end. I think that's cool. I don't love that they kind of toss around this idea of eternal punishment at the end of the episode. I'm not a big fan of that. I think the concept of eternity for me, and granted, I'm a religious person, and that's like, I don't like the idea of a digital eternity, and that's just me personally. You might disagree. Feel free to argue with me in the comments section below. I hate that concept, and it's part of why I don't love the ending to San Junipero. But they just kind of throw it around in this episode and don't really do anything with it. And I think they use it for just kind of a cheap laugh. Whereas for me, it's more of a cosmic horror idea. And I just really don't like it. Otherwise, it's a good episode. But like I said, the middle section and the ending are not great for what I like out of my Black Mirror. And so for me, White Christmas sits firmly in 11th place, kind of near the top of B tier there. And then top of B tier in 10th place is honestly what used to be my favorite episode of Black Mirror, and that was Playtest. Now, I do want to say, so the first time I watched Playtest was probably the spring of 2018. And I was at a point in my life, it was my freshman year of college, and I was at a point in my life where in terms of media, I was still I hadn't quite grasped this idea of what makes media good and what do I like about media and how to balance that. And I was really at a point in my life where I liked subversion of expectations. This was before Last Jedi came out. And so I loved any media that subverted my expectations, even if it didn't mean anything. And I loved playtests, specifically the ending of playtests, because there's basically 3 different endings, right? We get to the end of the first section where Cooper loses his memory, and they ship him away because he has fallen victim to the game, to the point where the game has eroded his memory, because that's his worst fear, right? His dad died of Alzheimer's, so he doesn't want to end up like his father. And so the game basically kills him the same way that his father died. That's part 1. Then he wakes up and he goes home. Finally, he has enough money to go back to the United States, back to Syracuse, and he gets home to his mom. And when he gets there, then with the second ending, she has succumbed to Alzheimer's as well. And so we get this other horrific ending for him. Not that he now is dying of Alzheimer's, but that his mom is as well. And most of that, his lost time with his mom, is as a result of him not answering her and him leaving her. And so he has to deal with this horror that he caused, not indirectly caused his mother's death, but he is responsible for the lack of time with his mom that meant so much to him with his dad. Then they flip the script again, and we have the third ending where instead of going home and seeing his mom, he wakes up. It doesn't actually wake up, but it's all going on in his head as a result of his phone going off when they first put on the headset when it's downloading. And we get this flashback to earlier on in the episode where we learn that he didn't even go through physically any of the horrors that we just saw in the last, 20, 30 minutes of the episode. It's all been in his head in that flashpoint moment. Now, the ending is cheesy. The last little line where he called mom is cheesy. But all in all, I think this episode is still very good. I just don't like that it kept subverting the expectations with the ending. And so for me, it's no longer my favorite episode of Black Mirror. It's all the way down in 10th, but it's not a bad episode necessarily, but for me, it's top of B tier now. I think Wyatt Russell is phenomenal in everything. It's Kurt Russell's kid. He's got a lot of acting chops. You may not have liked him in Captain America. He was kind of the main antagonist in the Falcon and Winter Soldier TV show. I never actually made it through the entirety of that season, but from what I saw of him in that, I really liked him. I think Wyatt Russell is a phenomenal actor. I think all of the side characters are very well acted, and I think this episode is very well written, very well paced. The directing is fantastic with the horror type stuff. I really like this episode. It just, the triple ending has lost its luster for me over the years. So for me, it sits in 10th place, top of B tier. We move up to A tier, to one of the episodes that has, that I have opened up to the most, that I have grown to like the most. And in number 9, we are going to sit with Crocodile. Now, Crocodile, in my opinion, is the best directed of any of the Black Mirror episodes. The first time I watched it, I didn't love the Scandi noir aesthetic, this kind of bleakness of Iceland. I do really connect with this episode because most of the locations in this episode I have been to. This episode was filmed and takes place in Iceland. So for example, one of the scenes of her giving a speech at the beginning, because she's kind of this record-setting architect. That scene takes place in the Opera House in Reykjavik, which I have been to. It's one of my favorite Scandinavian buildings architecturally, and that's a hint for a future episode on this channel when we move into architecture content. But this episode is very well directed, very well acted, and I think most of why I didn't connect with it the first time I watched it is maybe the headspace I was in the first time I watched it. If you watch this really open to this episode, understanding it from a technology perspective, from a concept perspective, I think this episode is great. The performance by, let me get this actress's name here. The performance by Andrea Riseborough, is that right? Yes, Andrea Riseborough is phenomenal. We see in her eyes just how her life is slowly falling apart, and what she is willing to do to cover up this secret so that her life doesn't fall apart, which, of course, that's called hubris, kids. This is 8th grade literary analysis class. Just her inability to take responsibility for things makes things even worse as time goes on. One of my favorite scenes in this entire episode is the scene where she kills the dad and then is leaving. Now, you could argue she shouldn't have taken off her mask, but when she takes off her mask, keep in mind what we're dealing with in this episode is a technology that you're able to basically a prosecutor is able to see the memories of a person. And so she kills everyone who is related to this murder, or who knows that she is related to this murder. And then as soon as she kills the father, she's about to leave this house, and we hear the baby cry. And they don't show the baby right away. I think it's one of the best directorial moments in this episode. They just zoom in on her face and her slow realization that this baby just witnessed me murder his father, and they're going to have it on record, and I have to kill this kid. That, like, just them, the directing and zooming in on her face in her realization of that. Fantastic acting, fantastic directing. I love this episode. I think all of the performances in this episode are very well done. It's a very well written episode. Everything is really tight, in my opinion, and I didn't really get that the first time I watched it. And I want to rewatch this episode again because it has grown on me so much. I do really like Crocodile. It's not always the easiest episode to get through. There is a lot of just like the acting is so good, especially in the torture scene where she's about to kill Shazia in the shack in the middle of nowhere. It's a little hard to get through because it's very well acted by Kiran Sonia Sawar. But I really like this episode. Very well directed, very well acted. Sits in A tier for me at number 9. Number 8 for me is 15 Million Merits. This is an episode a lot of people really like. Some people, it's their favorite episode. I don't love this episode for a couple reasons. Mostly, it's atmospheric. I don't love the cartoony, like this combination of bland, cartoony, the costuming and the design of the sets. I personally don't like that. I don't think it takes away from the overall impact of the episode. I just personally don't like it that much. I think this episode is probably what got the show off the ground, right? National Anthem is a hard episode to get through, but once you get to 15 Million Merits, this is where most people fall in love with the show. This concept of consumerism, this concept of technology over just kind of what is right for society versus what is right for the elite. And this episode handles a lot of very heavy themes. And for the most part, we come out of this episode with a greater kind of understanding of these characters' motivations. We see the dangers in the technologies proposed in this episode. We see a devolution of society in this episode. I think it's very good. I think Daniel Kaluuya is fantastic. He's great in everything, though. I don't love the performance of, what is the actress who plays Abby? Her name is Jessica Brown Finley. I don't love her performance, but it might be more so the writing and them writing her as a little bit of a bland character who Bing just falls in love with. This episode centers around Bing. And so the fact that they give Daniel Kaluuya more to work with, I think, is better. These side characters, we don't really get to know them, but we understand them and their motivations. Very small cast, very easy and simple episode, but dealing with a lot of grand concepts. And I don't think any of them really fall short. The ending is left ambiguous in a very grand way. And I think it is very well done. I think this episode has everything put together in a very cohesive and a very strong and a very, the writers knew what they were doing with the material given, and they put it to us on a silver platter and said, eat and do with this what you will. I think this episode succeeds where most of the episodes we talked about in D tier do not. So for me, 15 Million Merits sits right up there in A tier. For me, it's number 8 on my list. Number 7 is Hang the DJ. I do really like this episode. This, for me, is one of the more fun episodes of Black Mirror, even given the fact that it is dealing with some serious dark material. I think the chemistry between... I always forget the kid's... the actor's name here. He was in End of the World. Alex Lothar. I think Alex Lothar is phenomenal in this episode. A lot of people don't like his performance because they haven't seen him in anything else. They don't know what he's able to do with the material they gave him here. And his portrayal of this awkward, sheltered, secluded, secretive teenage kid is very well done. One thing that I didn't notice the first time watching this episode, and a lot of people it seems to have gone over their head as well, and I don't blame them. It's this idea that people feel like him being a pedophile kind of comes out of nowhere at the end of the episode. It doesn't. They sprinkle little hints of that throughout the episode with the girl leaving her stuffed animal at the table at the beginning of the episode. The way that he interacts with that kid is fantastic. Alex Lothar's ability to flip on a dime to show how comfortable Kenny is with children rather than how comfortable he is with adults adds an extra layer that you really don't pick up. At least I didn't pick up until the third or fourth time that I watched this episode. I think his chemistry with Jerome Flynn as kind of this, not Bonnie and Clyde, but almost like a Thelma and Louise, like just they shouldn't work well together, and they do. Their chemistry is great in an awkward way. Some people think their chemistry is bad because of the way that the characters interact with each other. I disagree. I think Alex Lothar's awkward chemistry comes off perfectly with Jerome Flynn's macho energy that he tries to portray in this episode, where Jerome Flynn adds this kind of underlying cowardice. And this episode deals with some serious heavy concepts. I know that the ending is kind of polarizing, what with the reveal that Kenny was looking at what he was looking at, along with the fact that it was all to troll these people. I don't love the inclusion of the troll face at the end of the episode, but I think had we not had that image and still had the same ending where all of it was to just troll these people and someone was high on power and allowed these people and made these people do what they did to assist them in very petty and very like over the top crimes that they otherwise wouldn't get away with, I think it's a very powerful episode. It's not S tier for me. It's just missing a little bit of that seriousness. But it's a very fun episode, very rewatchable episode for me. And for me, it sits firmly in, what would that be, 7th place? Let me just double check that. Yes, 7th place there. So moving up to 6th place then, we have Hang the DJ. This for me is always a very forgettable episode. And I don't quite know why. It might be the fact that it is very similar in concept to San Junipero. Now let me take a quick sip of my drink here. In terms of, it is a love story in a very similar directing style in seasons back to back, takes place very similarly in where it sits in the season. Although, you know, one has to do with a gay relationship, one has to do with a straight relationship. Basically, this is what would happen if your Tinder profile was alive. Is basically what this episode is about. It deals with a lot of concepts of trust. It has to do with anticipation in relationships. It has to do with this grand historic concept of finding your perfect match or love at first sight, and how we can better equip ourselves to deal with something like that so that the awkwardness of interaction and the awkwardness of initial chemistry with people is taken away. It has to deal with just the concepts of how you interact with partners, how comfortable you are in situations. It kind of has this weird message of forced marriages or forced relationships that they push into the episode. And it deals with them all to the point we get to this episode and all we want is for the characters to finally fall for each other. We feel their chemistry right from the off, and this episode dangles it on a string in front of us throughout the rest of the episode. Why I don't think it's an S tier episode, honestly, I think it's a little short. This episode sits at, I don't think its runtime is that short, but to me, it has always felt like we should have more to do with it. It's 51 minutes long, so it's not like aggressively short. It just feels like the story flows so well that we want more out of it. That for me at least, I want to dig more into this concept, and I wish they would have shown us a little more of their personal interaction at the end of the episode once their profiles do actually link up and their actual selves meet each other for the first time. Like I said, though, it is kind of a forgettable episode, and I think most of that, like I said, has to do with how similar it is to San Junipero. And just for the sake of its forgettableness, I can't put it quite S tier, but I think it's a very good episode. It's a very fun episode, and I think it sits right there in the middle of A tier for me in 6th place. And then we get to the top of A tier for me. In 5th place, I am putting San Junipero. Now, a lot of people, this is their favorite episode. This episode means a lot for the gay fans of Black Mirror. Like I said, a lot of my problems with this episode are twofold. It's atmospheric. I don't get anything from 80s nostalgia the way that a lot of people do. A lot of it is my age. I was born in the late 90s. I don't connect well with the 80s. My parents were in their 20s in the 80s, and so a lot of what made up their youth has to do with the late 70s, and so I never grew up with the 80s nostalgia that my parents should have had, that a lot of people my age had, or a lot of people similar to my age had as well. So the 80s scene doesn't do anything for me. I actually really like the stuff when they go to like 2002 or 2006, that sort of vibe. I think that's really fun. I think the chemistry between the two main characters is great. I love, oh gosh, I always butcher how to pronounce her last name. Gugu Mbatha-Raw Gugu Mbatha-Raw is how to pronounce her name. I know her from Doctor Who. Of course, she was Martha's sister in season 3 of Doctor Who. But she plays Yorkie in this episode. Or, no. Get the characters' names confused here. She plays Kelly. Yorkie is played by Mackenzie Davis, who, if you've never seen her in other stuff, you might think she's a little one note in this episode. But I think both of them play their characters to perfection. I think their chemistry is fantastic. My big gripe with this episode comes in the ending. Now, here's what we get from the perspective of Kelly. So, right, these two different characters are meeting in San Junipero, which is a virtual reality service that is both used to help elderly people come to terms or live their final days with nostalgia for their youth, right? That is the whole point of this service. And at the same time, it also allows deceased people to upload their consciousness into an eternal heaven in San Junipero so they can live out the rest of their digital existence for eternity in either of these San Junipero locations. It deals with some really heavy concepts, one of them including digital eternity versus religious eternity. And for me, like I mentioned earlier in this video, that is where my disconnect with where these characters sit with that concept comes. There's a really cool concept with the Quagmire, right? Where eventually these people who have uploaded themselves to eternal consciousness they get to a point where they struggle to feel anything anymore. And so that's why they're exploring sexualities they wouldn't otherwise. They're exploring dark sides of just physical empowerment that they wouldn't otherwise have. This episode deals with eternity in a very human, very technological way. It brings up the concept of like religious eternality, but it ignores this idea. How do I put, because this is a grand idea that I'm not going to voice very well in this video. This is a whole nother concept that someone more qualified than me would have to bring up in a very long video essay. As someone who deals often with the concept of religious eternality, one thing that people often challenge it with, those who are not religious, is this idea of, well, eventually eternity is going to be boring, right? As someone who is religious, my perspective on that is eternity would be boring were the eternity that I believe in based on human ideas of satisfaction, right? So if eternity were a constant existence of our life on Earth, then yes, eternity would be boring. I don't believe in that because I believe that the eternity I believe in is beyond the concepts of humanity, right? Is dealing with concepts where we will never be bored of what we do. We will never eternity will be eternal in a way that humanity can't comprehend. And this episode, so that point aside, this episode touches on religious eternality with Kelly and with her husband. And what I don't like about this episode's ending is not that it's a happy ending, it's that Kelly turns on a dime for what I perceive to be no reason. I understand that she has this like near-death experience with the car accident at the end of the episode, and that parallels Yorkie's car accident, which I think is very good writing. However, I think her idea to flip on a switch and basically abandon what her husband and her daughter went through, and her maybe not believing in this religious eternity, but having this hope for a religious eternity, right? That she will one day be reunited with her husband and her daughter. The fact that she flips on a dime, but the episode doesn't really explore her cowardice in that decision or her not quite believing in religious eternity and wanting to believe in a technological eternity. The episode doesn't give us that necessarily. At least from my perspective, it doesn't really give us that. It basically has her flip on a dime, and the ending to me has always felt a little rushed. It is a happy ending if you believe that these characters are going to be happy in a human technological eternity. For me, as like I said, with my background, with my belief system, it has always felt a little like a cosmic eternity horror, but if you subscribe to this idea of humanity, technological eternity, then it is a happy ending. Like I said, my issues come more so in the fact that Kelly feels like she flips on a dime and the episode doesn't flesh that out the way that it should. So for me, that is why San Junipero isn't in S tier, but it sits right at the top of A tier, number 5 on my list. That was a long explanation. So let's go to S tier then. We have 4 episodes in S tier before season 6. Number 4 is Nosedive. This is the episode, much like Crocodile, that has grown on me the most. The first time I watched this episode, I hated it. I don't love the pastel color scheme. I don't like the way that these characters are acted. At least I didn't the first time I watched it. I am 5 years on from the first time I watched Nosedive, and the more that I watch this episode, every single thing in this episode hits for me. Bryce Dallas Howard performs her character perfectly, and that's one thing that I didn't get the first time I watched Nosedive. I didn't really understand why the characters were acting the way that they do. Now, keep in mind, 5 years ago, I was living on my own with a group of guys, and the concept of living for, I'm saying this in a way that's going to sound very, I don't want to say misogynistic, but the group of people that I surrounded myself with 5 years ago, the first time I watched this episode, we were not encapsulated by this idea of social credit or wanting to impress other people the way that they do in this episode. 5 years on, I understand that most people nowadays really do deal with this concept, and the way that you portray yourself to other people, especially online, is very in line with how these characters are written in the episode. None of the comedy in this episode really landed for me the first time I watched it, and now the more I watch it, the more it does. This episode was co-written by Rashida Jones, who you'd probably know from something like The Office or Parks and Rec. She co-wrote this episode, I think, with Charlie Brooker, and you can see that. You can see where the comedic elements come in. You can see where the pop culture references come into this episode. Michaela Cole as the airport attendant, I think, is fantastic. All the interactions between the characters I love now when I finally understand what they are going for with the tone of this episode. This episode feels like a Wes Anderson movie in the 22nd century, is always how I describe this to people. It feels very, very strict, very to the point, and I didn't quite understand the first time I watched this why they're doing that. Now I do. Until you get to the end of the episode, with the dust scene. And what I mean by the dust scene is after she gets arrested, after the wedding, we get this image where for the first time, Lacey is looking up without her ability to see social media. And we just see dust falling from the ceiling in her prison cell. Everything up to that scene is shot in a way that is perfect or very, very pristine. And they do that on purpose because what they're wanting to get across in this is a physical understanding, a visual representation of perfection. That is what these characters are striving for. And by the end of this episode, what Lacey comes to realize is that's not what she wants her life to be about anymore. And that's where they let the guard down, and we no longer have really this perfect shot composition that we have until the end of the episode. I really like Nosedive. I think it's one of the most rewatchable episodes. It's one of those classic sitcom tropes where everything would go right were it not for this one decision. And so you watch this episode and you keep wanting everything to go right for this character, and then they make that one decision and everything falls off the rails. I love this episode. Like I said, the more I watch it, the more I love this episode. Everything is near perfect. It just, for me, it's not quite Black Mirror perfect the way that the other 3 episodes on my list are. And so as we move into the top 3 now, let's go to number 3, USS Callister. This is another very, very well directed episode. I think all of the performances in this episode are fantastic. Jesse Plemons really stretches what he's able to do with his acting in this episode. I think the idea to call back to Star Trek is inspired, and what they're able to do, basically crushing. How do I say this? The whole point of this episode is dealing with toxic masculinity, and I say that in a way that I don't want to come across as cringy or as me preaching a certain political stance. The whole point of this episode is dealing with what toxic men or insecure men would be able to do with their own world, right? And so that's what this episode deals with, is Robert Daly not being able to live the way he feels he is owed in the world. And so he creates his own virtual reality while not coming to terms with the fact that this reality is living and alive, and these people have feelings and are dealing with feelings themselves. And it is this horror of there's the ethics of cloning that we deal with in the Cookie episode. There's so many concepts here that they are dealing with, and they handle them really, really well. The stuff with him turning all of the people who don't listen to him into monsters, this idea that he is taking away the humanity from all the people he is trapped inside his virtual game, and punishing, in a virtual sense, the people that have done him wrong in reality. Everything about this episode is done really, really well. Now, I understand that if you're not into the whole sci-fi thing, if you don't understand the whole Star Trek vibe that they're going with, this episode might not mean as much to you. I understand that. For me personally, as someone who isn't even a huge Star Trek fan, but understands science fiction, understands the concepts they were going for with this episode, this sits super high for me. And it always has. This was the first episode of Black Mirror that I ever watched, and this was the reason I fell in love with the show. And I keep waiting for this episode to go down for me in terms of its quality, in terms of what I take away from this episode. And it never does. This episode has held up more than basically any other episode I've ever seen in this show. It has always been a top tier episode for me. Even the more I watch it, it never quite loses what it does for me every time I watch it. USS Callister, number 3 on my list in S tier. We move up to number 2, the one episode of Black Mirror that kind of feels, well, I shouldn't say that because I've said that about a bunch of episodes, but from a writing style perspective, this is the most distinct Black Mirror episode. We're talking about The Entire History of You, the season finale to season 1. This was written not by Charlie Brooker, as every other episode was. This episode was solely written by Jesse Armstrong, who you might know as the creator of the show Succession. So this episode, of course, deals with the idea of what if you were able to relive your memories? How would that affect your interactions with other people? Because the people in this episode are technically able to forgive and forget, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them fixate on ideas and use technology to that advantage. I think the performances from Toby Kebbell and Jodie Whittaker in this episode are unbelievable. If you're like me and you don't like Jodie Whittaker in Doctor Who, go and watch this episode. I know, like, okay, I like Doctor Who a lot. If you can see behind me, there is a little TARDIS thing back there. I have TARDIS keys all over the place. In November, we are doing a 2-week series on Doctor Who. I don't love Jodie Whittaker's performance as the 13th Doctor. It has nothing to do with the fact that she's the first female Doctor. It has nothing to do with the subject material they cover on that show. I just think she was written very poorly in Doctor Who and doesn't do very well with the material that she's given. Jodie Whittaker in Black Mirror is phenomenal. Toby Kebbell in this episode is phenomenal. It's very much like Nosedive, where as soon as the instigating event happens, everything just falls off the rails, and you want these characters to succeed and pull through, and they just keep getting worse and worse and worse, and it delves into the worst of these two characters until we get to the point where their relationship is so soured by what would otherwise, if it weren't for the technology, would otherwise be a very simple interaction between two people. We don't get that. They fall apart off the rails. Where I was the first time I saw this episode in my life, I was dealing with a frustrating breakup, and I was insecure in myself to the point that one of my biggest fears was how this person was moving on without me and how this person was dealing with their own new relationships without me. That was something I was really struggling with. Then I watched this episode and I went, holy crap, this guy's just like me. No, it was... This episode put me into a headspace where I had to reflect on what I was doing. And this episode hit me really, really hard and was super impactful. It was also super impactful to Robert Downey Jr., who actually, after watching this episode once, bought the film rights to it. So this is the only episode of Black Mirror where the concept rights have been bought by an exterior person. So Robert Downey Jr. owns the film rights to make a film adaptation of The Entire History of You. Interesting little side fact. But I think this episode really is strong in its both concept and execution of what we would do to our own relationships were we able to seriously analyze them in a literary or film sense, the way that we're not really able to because we don't have the ability to capture our memories. Super strong episode, fantastic performances, great writing. We move on to the best episode, in my opinion, in Black Mirror's history. Will it stand up with season 6? You'll have to find out tomorrow. But for me, the best episode through season 5 of Black Mirror is Be Right Back. This is the opener to season 2. It stars Hayley Atwell and Domhnall Gleeson as these two, I think... Wikipedia just says boyfriend. So it's these two partners who are just living their life and slowly getting to know each other more and more. And then tragedy strikes and their relationship is cut short. And Martha has to deal with both the concept of losing Ash and then the fact that she finds out she's pregnant. And then there's this technology that comes into her life and she has to deal with this idea of, do I live my life the way other people always have and deal with this trauma and raise this baby on my own without it knowing its father? Or do I give into this technology and bring this person back? And the episode lingers on that idea long enough where we understand why she does it. And then we get to the point where the technology advances to where she is able to physically bring back Ash, or at least a digital copy of himself. And things start to fall apart because the clone version of Ash is only based on his internet and texting and calling profile. And so he's only what he portrays to the world. It's not what he portrayed to her. It's not a perfect replication of his memory. And so one thing I love about this episode that I see the more I watch it is how tight this script is. This episode has the tightest script of any Black Mirror episode I've ever come across. And what I mean by that is there are little ticks and little world building devices and little interactions and little writing tidbits throughout this episode that they drop at the beginning of the episode that in a grander scope, like writers drop things into scripts that don't mean anything, right? Little character beats, little interactions that don't mean anything for the rest of the episode. In what I've seen of this episode, I've probably seen this episode 10 times, right? Every time I watch this episode, I see every little line of dialogue, every little piece of background music, every little character piece is there for a reason, because it's brought back up in some way later on in the episode, right? Ash singing the Bee Gees. What does that mean for Martha's relationship with the clone version of him later on? It means a whole lot, because she learns in the beginning of this episode that Ash has a secret love for a music that she never knew about. She is able to learn more about her partner because it is an organic, interactive relationship. Whereas when he comes back with the clone version of himself, he has no ability to learn new things or to teach her new things about himself that she never knew before. We wouldn't get that if it weren't for this little tiny drop of the Bee Gees at the beginning of the episode, or the little bit of him kind of ignoring her at the gas station at the beginning of this episode. Just little lines of dialogue, little character interactions that are fantastic. This episode is so tight and so perfect, and the music in this episode is so just atmospheric and encapsulating, and the performances from Domhnall Gleeson, both in his pre-accident Ash and post-accident version of Ash, and Hayley Atwell having to deal with all of these emotions and pulling this episode together, they are phenomenal. Their chemistry is phenomenal. I have one single gripe with this episode, and that is the ending. I don't think this episode benefits from, I don't even know if it's a post-credits scene or if it's the scene right at the end of the episode before the credits, but I wish they would have left this episode ambiguous. It's one of the few episodes of Black Mirror that I wish they hadn't given us what happens, right? So they're standing on the cliff. She tells the clone version of Ash to jump off and kill himself, and he says he's going to do it. And then she's upset because the real Ash would argue with her. But then the clone Ash starts arguing back to her, and then she realizes that's not what she doesn't know what she wants because she wants Ash back. And this clearly isn't Ash. She screams, and I wish the episode just ended there. It's left ambiguous as to whether he jumps off the cliff, whether she pushes him off the cliff, or whether she has to deal with this herself, or maybe she jumps to her death herself because she can't deal with what's going on. I wish the episode ended there. I do. I really do. It gives us this cool little scene at the end where Ash is up in the attic. She no longer interacts with him, but he operates as kind of this fake father character to their daughter. I wish it didn't have that. That is the only problem I have with this episode. But that being said, it is still my favorite episode of Black Mirror. Here is where all 23 episodes of seasons 1 through 5 sit before we move on to season 6 tomorrow. In place number 23, bottom of D tier, in my opinion, the worst episode of Black Mirror up through season 5 is Rachel, Jack, and Ashley 2. Number 22 is the Waldo moment. 21 is Archangel. 20, Smithereens. 19, Bandersnatch. 18, top of D tier, is Striking Vipers. Number 17, as we move up to C tier, is Men Against Fire. Number 16, Metalhead. Number 15, Black Museum, top of C tier. We move up to B tier. I believe we're up to number 14 now. That is the National Anthem. Number 13, White Bear, Number 12, Hated in the Nation. Number 11, White Christmas. Number 10, Playtest. We move up to A tier episodes. Number 9, Crocodile. Number 8, 15 Million Merits. Number 7, Shut Up and Dance. Number 6, Hang the DJ. Number 5, top of A tier, San Junipero. Number 4, in S tier is Nosedive. Number 3, USS Callister. Number 2, The Entire History of You. And number 1, Be Right Back. So that is all of my rankings for the first 23 episodes of Black Mirror seasons 1 through 5, including the Christmas special and the interactive movie. Let me know how wrong I am. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments section below. We will be back tomorrow with our inclusion of all of the episodes from season 6 tomorrow, where we will add them to this list and do an overall ranking of all. Let's see, how many episodes are in season 6 here? There are 5 episodes. I think I said at the beginning of this that there were 6. So there are 5 episodes. We will have all 28 episodes of Black Mirror ranked in tomorrow's version as well. Stay tuned for part 2. That will air at 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow morning. In the meantime, there should be plenty of other Black Mirror content with a link on the bottom left hand of your screen. Links to the channels above as this video comes to a close. Check out everything else we have to offer on the channel. If you like this video, if you didn't like this video, let me know. Like, share, subscribe, do your thing on YouTube, and we will hopefully see you very, very soon.